In a scorched layer of earth beneath the ruins of an ancient city, priests once abandoned their altars without fire, without blood, without farewell, as if the gods themselves had stood up and walked away. Why would temples fall silent overnight? Why would rituals stop mid-gesture, tools left where hands had last touched them? Why do tablets speak of departure instead of destruction, of completion instead of collapse? And why does history insist on calling these moments myth when the ground itself tells another story? Before we dive deeper, ignite that like button and prepare for the revelations to come. Tell me in the comments where you are listening from, what time it is there, and as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. The tablets did not announce catastrophe. They did not cry out in poetry or thunder in praise. Their surfaces were worn, uneven, cracked by time, yet the language carved into them carried a strangely administrative calm, like a ledger closing its final account. In the ruins of Nippur, where dust once clung to priests' robes and incense, smoke stained the air, these late Sumerian texts described what later scholars would cautiously label a withdrawal. The word itself feels insufficient. What the tablets recorded was not a fading of belief, not the collapse of a cult, but the end of an operation. The script begins with the expected invocation to Enlil, the Lord of Wind and Authority, but the rhythm quickly changes. The phrases become clipped, precise, almost procedural. A gathering is described, not as a festival or cosmic drama, but as a council. Decisions are weighed. Timelines are referenced. Tasks are said to have reached completion. The tone resembles a military report or a civic decree more than a hymn. In a culture where gods were normally praised through metaphor and excess, this restraint is deeply unsettling. Archaeology does not contradict the tablets. At Nippur, excavation revealed a sudden stillness frozen in earth. Offering tables remained set. Vessels lay where they had last been used. There were no burn layers, no smashed idols, no signs of invasion or fire. It was as if the city's sacred heart had been paused rather than destroyed. Carbon dating placed this moment around the early 2nd millennium BC, aligning closely with the period described in the texts. Ritual activity, which had continued without interruption for centuries, simply stopped. This pattern repeated elsewhere. At Eridu, considered the oldest city in Sumerian memory, the temple complex showed evidence of an intentional closing rather than abandonment. Sacred objects were carefully arranged, precious materials positioned with symmetry, and chambers sealed using substances known even today for their preservative qualities, like bitumen and cedar resin. These materials were layered deliberately, suggesting knowledge of how to stabilize air, moisture, and temperature over immense spans of time. This was not neglect, it was preparation. The texts from Eridu describe a final ceremony, not one of mourning, but of transition. Tools were cleaned, spaces were ordered. The divine presence was not said to vanish, but to ascend. The language used to describe this ascent is strikingly practical. The words chosen are the same ones used elsewhere to describe officials returning to a distant capital or troops withdrawing from a completed campaign. When translated literally, the phrases imply relocation, not disappearance. What makes these accounts more difficult to dismiss is the consistency across sites. Uruk, Lagash, and other major religious centers show the same archaeological signature. Temples sealed, maintenance halted mid-task, renovations left unfinished. At Uruk's Anu temple, drainage systems were blocked intentionally, access points closed with engineering precision. Valuable objects were stored, not looted. The inner spaces were preserved as if meant to remain untouched for ages. Sumerian myth has long been treated as symbolic storytelling, yet here symbolism gives way to logistics. Even the language of the Ikur Genesis, one of humanity's earliest creation narratives, changes tone when describing the end of divine involvement. The gods are said to have completed their appointed work and returned to their dwelling above. The phrasing lacks moral judgment. There is no punishment, no failure, only fulfillment. Later, Akkadian and Babylonian texts echo this memory, though with increasing layers of legend. The Epic of ARCHAEON, best known for its flood story, includes quieter passages describing a time when the Great Ones withdrew to their high house after ensuring humanity could stand on its own. In these sections, humans are not abandoned but assigned intermediaries, individuals trained to observe the sky, maintain rituals, and preserve contact without direct presence. The gods, it seems, did not vanish. They changed the terms of engagement. Administrative tablets from centuries later reinforce this interpretation. Neo-Babylonian temple records reference ancient protocols for communicating with those who had departed. These were not prayers in the emotional sense, but scheduled procedures tied to astronomical observation. Specific dates, star positions, and ritual conditions are listed, as if contact depended on alignment rather than devotion. Institutional memory, remarkably, survived long after belief systems evolved. Physical artifacts complicate the picture further. In sealed chambers beneath temples, archaeologists have found instruments that defy easy classification. Crystalline components set into precise geometric frames. Metallic alloys unfamiliar to standard Mesopotamian metallurgy. Devices aligned to cardinal directions and celestial angles with a precision that suggests function beyond decoration. These objects were not integrated into later cultural layers. They were sealed away, preserved alongside the silence. At the same time, these temples fell quiet. Mesopotamian civilization itself shifted. The transition from Sumerian dominance to Babylonian rule was not merely political. Certain technological trajectories halted abruptly. Others emerged, different in character, less centralized, more symbolic. Writing systems changed. Religious practice became more interpretive, less immediate. Gods spoke through dreams and omens instead of direct command. The divine voice, once described as present and audible, receded into signs that required interpretation. Astronomical records from this era introduce another anomaly. Babylonian star texts note unusual lights in the sky during the same window of time. These were not comets or known planets. They moved against the fixed stars in deliberate paths, appeared for months, then vanished. The descriptions are sober, measured, written by observers trained to track celestial regularity. In the departure tablets, similar language appears, references to great lights that carried the Anunnaki to their place above. When these strands are woven together, the story that emerges is neither simple myth nor straightforward history. It is something in between, preserved through stone, clay, and silence. The temples did not fall. They were closed. The gods were not slain. They departed. And humanity, left with sealed chambers, altered skies, and instructions written in the calm language of completion, was forced to continue without the certainty of their presence. What happened next would reshape memory itself, not through collapse, but through adaptation, not through erasure, but through inheritance. The world did not end when the gods left. It changed its posture, looking upward instead of inward, waiting not for command, but for signs that the great withdrawal had not been the final word. The silence left behind by the closed temples did not mean absence of record. Beneath later empires and rewritten myths, fragments survived that preserved the arguments which preceded the departure. These were not poetic disputes between jealous gods, but structured deliberations recorded in mixed scripts, Sumerian threaded with early Akkadian glosses, as if scribes struggled to keep pace with the gravity of what they were asked to document. The council sessions described in these tablets read like transcripts of an institution facing its own limits. Within the Akur complex at Nippur, the council is said to have convened repeatedly over an extended period. Enlil presided, not as a thunderous tyrant, but as a figure of authority bound by cycles and calculations. Enki, often remembered as a trickster or benefactor in later retellings, appears here as a dissenting voice grounded in data. His arguments focused on humanity's incomplete readiness. He cited instability in governance, uneven distribution of knowledge, and the fragility of agricultural systems that still depended on direct oversight. These concerns were not moral, but logistical, framed around sustainability. Opposing him were those who argued that prolonged intervention would itself become an obstacle. The tablets reference appointed cycles, a term that appears repeatedly and always in connection with celestial measurement. These cycles were not metaphorical ages, but quantified spans, calculated against planetary movement and long-term environmental thresholds. Humanity, according to these calculations, had reached the minimum conditions required for autonomous development. To remain beyond that point risked stagnation rather than growth. What is striking is the presence of accounting language throughout the debate. One tablet attributed to Ninlil records resource tallies in dry numerical terms. Energy expenditures, material throughput, and supply continuity are all listed. The Anunnaki presence on Earth, these records suggest, was not effortless. It required constant inflow of materials that were not native to local ecosystems. Exotic metals, rare stones, and biologically specific substances were processed through temple facilities and transported to destinations never named in standard trade texts. Records from cities like Girsu show sudden increases in tribute demands during the final decades before departure. These were not ordinary offerings. The quantities exceeded ritual needs by orders of magnitude. Livestock was diverted not for sacrifice, but for extraction. The texts describe specialized processing of animal materials under controlled conditions, combined with mineral treatments and exposure to precise stellar alignments. This reads less like religion and more like industrial preparation. The most revealing document from this period is a silver tablet that lists transactions involving what is called sky metal. Described as heavier than gold and possessing properties that resisted corrosion and heat, it was collected from meteorite impacts across the region. Temple workshops refined it under direct supervision, then transferred it in sealed consignments. The tablet states plainly that these materials were required for the great vessels of return. No mythic language cushions the statement. It is recorded as a logistical necessity. These material concerns intertwined with a deeper test that had already taken place. The flood, long remembered as divine punishment, is described very differently in the departure tablets. Rather than a moral cleansing, it appears as a controlled stress event. The deluge is framed as a calibrated challenge designed to evaluate human resilience. Selected populations were preserved not out of mercy, but to ensure continuity of observation. The success or failure of post-flood reconstruction would determine whether humanity could recover without direct intervention. Archaeological layers support this interpretation. Flood deposits at Uruk and surrounding sites show patterns inconsistent with chaotic river overflow. Valuable materials appear to have been evacuated beforehand. Reconstruction begins almost immediately afterward, with access to knowledge and tools that would have been impossible if cultural memory had been wiped clean. The flood did not reset civilization. It tested its redundancy. Following the flood, the tablets describe new protocols. Direct governance was reduced. Human intermediaries were trained instead. These individuals were selected for cognitive aptitude, observational skill, and capacity to maintain secrecy. Their role was to sustain limited communication through ritualized astronomical observation. Contact would no longer be continuous or obvious. It would occur at thresholds, moments when celestial conditions aligned with predetermined parameters. This shift marks a turning point. The Anunnaki ceased to be rulers and became overseers in absentia. The council debates record a final weighing, an assessment that included resource depletion, operational sustainability, human development metrics, and internal consensus. The decision, when it came, was unanimous, though reached through compromise. Enki's concerns were acknowledged through the establishment of safeguards. Enlil's insistence on withdrawal was accepted as inevitable. Hidden within the appendices of these records is a lesser-known resolution. Not all would leave. A small number were designated to remain in diminished capacity. These figures, later remembered only as shadows or symbols, were assigned guardianship roles. Their task was observation, not command. They were to maintain knowledge reservoirs, protect critical sites, and intervene only through indirect means. The tablets emphasize restraint. Visibility was forbidden. Influence had to be subtle enough to be mistaken for human inspiration. This explains a shift visible in later texts. Gods no longer speak directly. They appear in dreams, omens, and symbolic discoveries. Architectural plans arrive through vision. Medical knowledge emerges through intuition. Innovations seem to arise spontaneously, attributed to wisdom rather than instruction. The machinery of guidance had not vanished. It had been concealed. The council records close with language that mirrors the opening tone of the withdrawal tablets. Duties are marked complete. Responsibilities are transferred. Timelines are sealed. There is no farewell. Only execution. The Anunnaki did not depart in haste or fear. They left because the conditions that required their presence had, by their own metrics, been satisfied. What followed was not abandonment, but inheritance under constraint. Humanity received fragments, intermediaries, and sealed spaces filled with knowledge it was not yet meant to access. The departure was not an ending written in flame, but a closing bracket carved into clay. And beneath that quiet finality lay an assumption that the story was not finished, only paused, awaiting conditions that might one day warrant a return. Those designated to remain did not inherit thrones or temples in the traditional sense. Their presence was designed to fade into structure rather than dominate it. The tablets refer to them obliquely, using titles that translate imperfectly as watchers, keepers of the threshold, or those who stand between. These phrases do not describe rulers. They describe functions. Each remaining figure was assigned a domain where knowledge was most vulnerable to loss, and where subtle continuity could shape human development without revealing an external hand. One such figure, remembered later through serpent imagery and underground symbolism, was tasked with preserving medical understanding. The texts describe his residence not as a palace, but as a station, embedded near a temple complex where healing practices were already established. Communication was restricted to dreams during specific lunar phases when human perception was believed to be more receptive. The choice of dreams was not mystical indulgence, but efficiency. Dreams left no physical evidence and could be dismissed as internal experience if questioned. Agricultural knowledge was placed under the care of a different guardian, one associated with fertility cycles and seasonal rhythm. Rather than remaining fixed in a single location, this figure was described as moving with the year, appearing at multiple sites across the Fertile Crescent. The tablets specify that information was conveyed through coded arrangements of plants, alterations in planting calendars, and ritualized seasonal ceremonies. To the untrained observer, these were traditions. To those instructed, they were technical updates. The preservation of written knowledge required a more complex approach. Writing was not merely communication, it was storage across time. A guardian associated with scribal tradition was assigned to oversee the continuity of text itself. Rather than dictating content, this figure influenced form. Subtle changes in sign order, standardized formatting, and the introduction of new symbols allowed increasingly complex ideas to be encoded without appearing revolutionary. Human scribes believed they were innovating. In reality, they were guided. Archaeology provides unexpected support for these accounts. Beneath certain temple sites, particularly at Borsippa, underground chambers show evidence of continuous occupation long after official abandonment. These spaces were engineered for permanence. Ventilation shafts circulated air without external openings. Water systems were concealed. Storage facilities were designed for long-term habitation by a small number of individuals. Most revealing was a scriptorium equipped with tools that exceeded the technological norms of the period. Tablets recovered from these chambers reveal a progression of mathematical and linguistic sophistication that appears inconsistent with surrounding cultural development. The handwriting varies, confirming multiple human scribes, yet the structure remains identical across generations. This suggests training under a stable guiding framework rather than organic evolution. Knowledge advanced, but the voice behind it remained constant. Another guardian was assigned to matters of death and transition, overseeing burial practices and the conceptualization of the afterlife. The tablets describe the establishment of mystery traditions, initiatory systems that preserved advanced understanding of consciousness while presenting themselves as religious ritual. Underground burial complexes near Kuta show construction techniques and preservation methods far beyond standard Mesopotamian practice. Bodies were treated to resist decay, and chambers were engineered to maintain stable internal conditions, echoing methods found independently in later Egyptian practice. Pastoral and nomadic populations were not ignored. A guardian associated with shepherding traditions maintained contact with mobile communities through ritual sites placed along seasonal migration routes. Stone circles and gathering points discovered across Mesopotamia align with astronomical markers and contain symbols that match descriptions in the tablets. These sites functioned as information hubs where animal breeding practices, land management strategies, and migration timing were reinforced through ceremony rather than instruction. Over time, the operational role of these guardians narrowed. Direct contact became increasingly rare. The emphasis shifted to observation and minimal correction. Tablets from the later Sumerian period describe strict protocols limiting intervention. Actions that could reveal non-human agency were forbidden. Communication had to align with human interpretive frameworks, appearing as insight, omen, or inspiration. This transformation is reflected in royal inscriptions. Earlier kings describe receiving commands directly from gods. Later rulers speak instead of dreams, signs, and favorable omens. The change is not linguistic fashion. It marks a systemic reduction in visibility. Divine authority became abstracted, filtered through priesthoods trained to interpret ambiguity rather than receive orders. To support this system, specialized training emerged. Selected individuals underwent education that far exceeded standard religious instruction. They studied mathematics to understand ratios and cycles, astronomy to track celestial markers, and symbolic systems that allowed layered meaning. These individuals acted as intermediaries, not knowing the full source of their knowledge, but maintaining its continuity. Physical infrastructure reinforced these practices. Underground chambers beneath Nippur and other major sites reveal deliberate acoustic and optical design. Mirrors, crystals, and metallic surfaces were arranged to manipulate light and sound during specific times of day and year. When activated under precise astronomical conditions, these chambers produced visual and auditory effects capable of inducing profound psychological experiences. To initiates, these were encounters. To outsiders, inaccessible mysteries. The sophistication of these environments suggests deep understanding of human perception. Sound resonance created the illusion of disembodied voices. Light refraction generated moving forms where none existed. Combined with fasting, isolation, and symbolic preparation, participants experienced these effects as genuine contact. The guardians did not need to appear. The system allowed their influence to be felt without presence. Administrative texts describe the standardization of these sites. Specifications for chamber dimensions, materials, and alignments appear across multiple locations. This uniformity implies centralized design rather than local experimentation. Mystery schools developed around these sites, training successive generations to operate the environments and interpret the resulting experiences. Evidence of continued guardian influence appears sporadically across centuries. Tablets describing sudden emergence of advanced medical treatments, agricultural techniques, or mathematical methods appear without clear developmental precursors. These innovations focus on application rather than theory, suggesting selective release of knowledge calibrated to societal readiness. The guardians were not teachers in the conventional sense. They were custodians of thresholds, ensuring humanity advanced without losing essential frameworks. Their presence was deliberately ambiguous, dissolving into myth even as their systems persisted. Over time, names faded, symbols multiplied, and memory blurred. What remained was structure, institutions, rituals, and knowledge pathways that continued to function long after their architects withdrew further into obscurity. The Anunnaki departure did not end with ascent. It extended into shadow. What followed was not absence, but a quieter form of guidance embedded within human systems, designed to endure until humanity either outgrew the need for it or reached a point where direct return would again become necessary. As the guardians receded into function rather than form, the architecture of memory became the true battlefield. Knowledge, once transmitted through direct instruction, now required protection against time, catastrophe, and misuse. The response was neither libraries in the open nor monuments meant to be admired. It was depth. Beneath the most sacred structures of Mesopotamia, spaces were carved not for worship, but for endurance. Administrative tablets from the late Sumerian period describe the construction of what are called houses of sealed wisdom. The language is precise. These were not storage rooms. They were systems. At Nippur, records specify chambers excavated more than 40 cubits below the temple foundation, a depth sufficient to stabilize temperature and isolate against surface disruption. The construction methods went beyond common brickwork. Fired bricks were bonded with bitumen mixed with rare mineral compounds, creating barriers resistant to water infiltration and microbial decay. Archaeological exploration confirms these descriptions. Beneath the ruins of Nippur, excavators uncovered the upper levels of a vast subterranean complex. Ventilation shafts were angled to promote air circulation without admitting light or moisture. The walls were coated with substances that analysis later revealed to be antimicrobial, combining cedar oil, resin, and metallic salts. These chambers were not designed to be visited often. They were designed to wait. The floors tell a similar story. Raised platforms integrated drainage channels that directed any condensation toward collection points, preventing damage to stored materials. Ceiling structures employed corbelling, reinforced with metallic elements, distributing load in ways uncommon for the era. These techniques suggest an understanding of stress, airflow, and long-term material behavior that exceeds what is typically attributed to Mesopotamian engineering. Nippur was not unique. Tablets from Eridu describe an even deeper complex, intended to preserve what the texts call foundation knowledge. This category encompassed mathematics, astronomy, and principles of natural order, the kind of understanding upon which all later innovation depends. Excavations at Eridu revealed chambers with mounting points for three-dimensional models. These were not decorative. They were instructional devices. Among the most remarkable finds at Eridu was a mechanical astronomical calculator. Constructed from interlocking bronze discs engraved with mathematical notations, it could model planetary movement, predict eclipses, and convert between calendar systems. The precision of its construction suggests advanced metallurgical processes. The device did not corrode. Its moving parts retained alignment across millennia. It functioned not as an artifact of belief, but as a tool. Uruk's archive complex focused on biological and medical preservation. Administrative texts describe chambers designed to maintain living essence. Temperature, humidity, and atmospheric composition were controlled to preserve organic materials. Archaeological investigation uncovered sealed containers made from crystalline substances and unfamiliar alloys, creating hermetic environments. Within them were plant specimens that retained cellular structure after thousands of years. Surgical instruments recovered from these chambers reveal another layer of sophistication. Cutting edges remain sharp. Measurement markings reach microscopic precision. Designs imply procedures not documented in known medical texts. These tools were not symbolic offerings. They were operational, preserved for future hands that would know how to use them. Babylon's subterranean complexes served a different function. Here, the focus was calculation. Tablets describe chambers housing mechanical devices capable of performing complex mathematical operations. Excavation uncovered large-scale models of the solar system and gear-driven calculators that tracked celestial cycles. The centerpiece was a massive astronomical mechanism that accounted for planetary conjunctions, equinox precession, and eclipse cycles with accuracy rivaling modern computation. Preservation of such devices required more than static storage. The tablets describe autonomous systems designed to maintain optimal conditions without human intervention. These included humidity regulation through chemical processes, air circulation driven by thermal gradients, and periodic renewal of preservative compounds. Archaeological evidence supports this. Some systems were still functional when discovered, having operated unattended for over 3,000 years. To manage these complexes, human custodians were trained through hereditary lines. These were not ordinary priests. Their education spanned decades and included mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, and mechanical operation. Training manuals specify calibration procedures, maintenance schedules, and emergency protocols. Access to different sections of the archives required both technical competence and symbolic authorization, a layered security system that protected knowledge from accidental or malicious misuse. Encryption played a central role. Sensitive information was not labeled openly. Mathematical data was embedded within religious texts through symbolic substitution. Astronomical instructions were hidden within mythic narratives, their technical meaning accessible only to those trained in interpretation. Mechanical devices required sequences of operations to activate, functioning as physical locks that doubled as instructional safeguards. Knowledge was not released wholesale. Administrative records describe controlled transfer events where specific information was introduced into broader society when conditions were deemed appropriate. An agricultural innovation might appear as a new ritual. A mathematical method might emerge as a commercial accounting technique. In this way, advanced understanding integrated gradually, appearing as human progress rather than external intervention. These archive complexes also served as research centers. Laboratory spaces contained equipment for chemical experimentation, alloy development, and biological study. Evidence of ongoing research appears in prototype devices and experimental materials found on site. This suggests that the remaining guardians continued to work through human intermediaries, refining knowledge rather than merely preserving it. Communication between archive sites was maintained through organized networks. messenger systems, and signal protocols ensured coordination. Periodic conferences brought custodians together to align practices and share developments. This network allowed the system to survive political collapse, shifting seamlessly as cities rose and fell above ground. Over time, access narrowed. As direct guardian involvement diminished further, archive knowledge became increasingly mythologized. Later texts reference hidden chambers and ancient wisdom, but lack the technical understanding required to enter or operate them fully. Attempts by later rulers to locate and exploit these repositories often failed, their inscriptions reflecting both awareness and frustration. What remained was a distributed memory system designed to outlast any single civilization. These underground archives were not meant to elevate humanity overnight. They were meant to prevent total loss. They ensured that even in collapse, seeds of advanced understanding would survive, waiting for rediscovery. The Anunnaki departure, then, was not a severing. It was a transition from presence to infrastructure. The gods did not leave nothing behind. They left systems that could sleep, systems that could endure, and systems that could one day awaken when humanity reached the point where sealed wisdom could safely be unsealed. Preservation of knowledge alone was never considered sufficient. Information could survive in stone and metal, yet still be misused, misunderstood, or lost through cultural rupture. The tablets make clear that a parallel strategy was implemented alongside the construction of archives, the cultivation of human continuity itself. This strategy did not rely on monuments or texts, but on bloodlines, carefully observed and deliberately shaped to carry memory where institutions might fail. The Sumerian king list, often dismissed as myth due to its extraordinary reign lengths, takes on a different character when read alongside administrative records from the final centuries of direct Anunnaki presence. These reigns are not described as symbolic ages, but as measured durations tied to biological capability. Tablets refer to selected individuals whose bodies could tolerate extended life through treatments unavailable to the general population. Longevity was not granted broadly. It was engineered selectively. Records from Uruk describe specialized medical procedures reserved for royal households. These involved compound treatments derived from rare minerals, biological extracts, and precisely timed applications aligned with astronomical cycles. The language used is technical rather than reverent. The goal was not immortality, but stability across generations, ensuring continuity of governance and knowledge stewardship during the transition into independence. Selection of these bloodlines was systematic. A tablet from the University of Pennsylvania collection outlines protocols for evaluating human populations. Physical measurements were taken, including cranial volume, skeletal density, and sensory acuity. Cognitive assessments tested pattern recognition, symbolic reasoning, and memory retention. Genealogical records traced family histories across multiple generations to identify recurring traits. Compatibility, not status, determined selection. Psychological evaluation played an equally important role. Candidates were assessed for discretion, emotional regulation, and resistance to coercion. These traits were essential for individuals who would be entrusted with knowledge that could destabilize societies if misused. The process resembles modern intelligence, vetting more than royal ceremony. Archaeological evidence supports these descriptions. Excavations within palace complexes revealed chambers equipped with measuring devices, astronomical instruments, and mechanical testing apparatus. These were not ceremonial spaces. They were evaluative. Stone platforms marked with precise gradations, bronze instruments designed for bodily assessment, and devices testing coordination and reaction speed point toward structured selection rather than divine whim. Burial practices further differentiate these bloodlines. Tombs associated with selected families show preservation techniques distinct from ordinary elite burials. Mummification methods aimed to preserve not only form, but genetic material. Crystalline containers and sealed metallic devices found in these tombs suggest post-mortem analysis or communication practices. The goal appears to have been continuity of information even beyond death. Queen Puabi's tomb provides a striking example. Alongside expected luxury items, excavators found astronomical instruments, chemical apparatus, and devices whose function remains unclear. Analysis of her remains revealed cranial and skeletal characteristics, deviating subtly but consistently from contemporary populations. These differences align with descriptions of hybridization found in administrative texts, suggesting controlled genetic integration rather than mythic exaggeration. Marriage protocols were designed to maintain these traits. Tablets detail compatibility testing prior to royal unions, including verification of lineage markers and reproductive planning. Ceremonies included biological rituals intended to enhance successful transmission of desired characteristics. These were not symbolic acts, they were procedural. Beyond ruling families, secondary noble lines were cultivated as reservoirs. Records from Mari contain genealogies tracking physical, intellectual, and behavioral traits across centuries with unprecedented precision. These records function as long-term data sets, monitoring inheritance patterns and identifying individuals suitable for advancement. The consistency of documentation suggests ongoing management rather than passive record-keeping. Hereditary priesthoods formed another pillar of this system. Certain families were selected for their ability to preserve complex knowledge through both genetic predisposition and intensive cultural training. Children born into these lines began education early, memorizing oral traditions, mastering symbolic systems, and learning technical procedures that required both cognitive aptitude and physiological tolerance. These priestly complexes were self-contained. Excavations in Babylon uncovered residential and educational facilities equipped with private libraries, observatories, laboratories, and communication chambers. The architectural quality exceeds standard temple construction, reflecting their importance. These families operated semi-autonomously, maintaining continuity even as political regimes changed. Astronomical texts such as the Enuma Anu Enlil reveal the depth of knowledge preserved through these lines. Predictive accuracy improved over centuries, indicating cumulative development rather than stagnation. Mathematical techniques embedded within these texts surpass what would be expected from the broader educational context, suggesting restricted transmission. Royal succession practices evolved accordingly. Tablets describe requirements beyond birthright, including demonstration of specific abilities and successful completion of knowledge tests. These tests could only be passed by individuals with both training and inherited aptitude. Authority thus remained concentrated within lines capable of maintaining contact with deeper systems of knowledge. Mystery schools emerged as controlled environments for further transmission. Operating within palaces and major temples, They provided advanced instruction exclusively to approved individuals. Curriculum included mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and engineering at levels inaccessible to the general population. Access was limited not by class alone, but by demonstrated capacity. Marriage alliances extended this network beyond Mesopotamia. Administrative records describe coordinated unions between royal houses in Anatolia, Egypt, and the Indus region. These alliances were negotiated with attention to genetic compatibility and knowledge exchange. Identical architectural features and shared technological artifacts across distant regions support the existence of sustained coordination. Medical texts from later periods describe diagnostic methods for identifying individuals carrying these inherited traits. Physical markers, cognitive performance, and sensory acuity were assessed. These methods persisted into the Persian period, indicating remarkable continuity. Persian inscriptions reference advisors of ancient blood who guided succession and governance using preserved criteria. Over time, these bloodlines dispersed, their origins increasingly obscured by cultural change. Yet patterns remained. Certain families repeatedly produced leaders, scholars, and innovators across civilizations. Architectural styles, mathematical concepts, and astronomical frameworks spread with them, shaping development while concealing their source. The preservation of bloodlines was never about domination. It was about redundancy. When archives could be buried and institutions could fall, living carriers ensured that essential frameworks survived. The Anunnaki did not entrust their legacy to stone alone. They embedded it within humanity itself, woven into lineage, memory, and capacity, designed to persist until the conditions arose where dormant knowledge could once again be consciously reclaimed. While knowledge was sealed beneath the earth and lineage preserved above it, the sky remained the final ledger. The departure of the Anunnaki was not treated as a vanishing act, but as a navigational problem. Sumerian astronomical texts from the final period of direct presence reveal a sudden leap in precision, as if observation had shifted from ritual timing to spatial calculation. The stars were no longer just signs. They became coordinates. The compendium, later known as Mul-Apin, often dated centuries after Sumer, carries within it layers that do not belong to its supposed era. Embedded in its star catalogs are positional discrepancies that make little sense if the observations were made from Earth alone. Certain constellations appear shifted, stretched, or reoriented. When these positions are reconstructed using modern astronomical modeling, they align not with Earth-based viewing, but with perspectives from far beyond, near the outer reaches of the solar system. The text divides the sky into three great pathways: the way of Anu, the way of Enlil, and the way of Ea. Later tradition reduced these to theological symbolism, but the underlying structure is geometric. Each pathway corresponds to a band of declination, mapping corridors through space rather than mythic domains. The way of Anu traces the high northern sky, the region least affected by planetary parallax, ideal for long-distance navigation. The way of Enlil spans the central band, dense with reference stars. The way of Ea covers the southern sky, anchored by some of the brightest stellar beacons known. Among these beacons, one stands out repeatedly. A cluster described as the gathered ones appears as a fixed point in departure calculations. Its description matches precisely with the Pleiades, a compact star group whose consistent relative positions make it a natural navigational anchor. The texts associate the opening of the star roads with specific alignments involving this cluster, suggesting use of gravitational timing rather than symbolic ceremony. Another reference defies easy explanation. The Star of the Wagon of Heaven is described as a 7-star formation used as a turning marker. No such configuration is visible from Earth. However, when stellar positions are projected from beyond Jupiter's orbit, a previously obscured alignment becomes visible. The implication is unsettling. Either the calculations were theoretical to an impossible degree, or observation occurred from a vantage point humanity did not possess. Ziggurats across Mesopotamia reveal architectural responses to this astronomical focus. These structures were not merely platforms for prayer. Their orientations align with specific stellar events tied to the departure routes. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, built during the reign of Ur-Nammu, incorporates sightlines that track the heliacal rising of the Pleiades during the vernal equinox. Secondary alignments correspond to the seasonal visibility of Canopus, a southern star used as a navigational reference in the Way of Ea. Excavations of ziggurat summits uncovered bronze fittings and stone mountings inconsistent with simple altars. Wear patterns indicate repeated adjustment of instruments rather than static display. These platforms functioned as observatories designed for sustained monitoring. At Babylon, the Anunnaki complex included multiple observation levels, each dedicated to a different class of celestial measurement. Some chambers were oriented not toward the horizon, but toward specific points deep in the sky. Operational tablets describe coordinated activity between these sites during what is called the Time of Great Ascension. Teams at different cities tracked separate variables, sharing data to refine timing and trajectory. Communication protocols are referenced obliquely, using phrases that translate as speaking stones and mirrors of the sky. While poetic on the surface, the descriptions include technical details about reflective surfaces, resonance chambers, and directional alignment. Artifacts recovered from these sites add weight to the texts. Crystalline lenses, polished metallic reflectors, and hollow chambers designed to amplify vibration have been found embedded within masonry. Chemical analysis shows materials processed to unusual purity beyond decorative requirement. These components appear purpose-built, not symbolic. The departure itself is described not as a single moment, but as a sequence. Astronomical records note moving lights that followed the documented pathways over months. These objects did not behave like comets. Their brightness remained stable. Their trajectories adjusted deliberately. Observers recorded their passage against fixed stars with the same care used to track planets, suggesting familiarity rather than awe. Festival calendars preserved memory of this sequence. The Akitu festival, later interpreted as a New Year celebration, included rites that reenacted stages of departure. Its 12-day structure corresponds to the duration described in tablets as the completion of the Star Road journey. During this period, priests conducted nightly observations, tracking the same stellar markers referenced in the departure texts. Even after the ascent, monitoring continued. Neo-Babylonian records describe ongoing astronomical programs tasked with observing the departure routes for signs of movement. These were not passive rituals. They involved precise calculation, long-term data collection, and correction for precession and proper motion, concepts not formally recognized until much later in human history. Some tablets describe moving stars returning briefly along the same paths, then disappearing again. The language is cautious, noting brightness variation, speed changes, and directional shifts. Modern classification would struggle to place such phenomena within natural categories. The observers, however, recorded them without speculation, treating them as expected variables within a known system. The mathematical tools used in these calculations were advanced. Iterative approximation, coordinate transformation, and spherical geometry appear in tablet form long before their supposed invention. Babylonian astronomers adjusted predictions based on error margins, refining models over generations. The precision achieved rivals that of early modern astronomy, yet lacks any developmental trail leading up to it. Communication attempts persisted. Tablets describe precisely timed transmissions directed toward fixed stellar coordinates using combinations of light reflection, sound resonance, and material excitation. The technical descriptions imply understanding of signal propagation across vast distances. Excavated equipment supports this, revealing devices designed to focus energy directionally rather than diffusely. The expectation of return is woven quietly into these practices. Observations were not merely historical, they were anticipatory. Texts reference cycles of 3,600 years, tied to orbital mechanics of a distant body whose influence was believed to affect navigational viability. Within these cycles, shorter windows were identified when conditions might permit renewed contact. What emerges from these records is not superstition, but patience. The sky became both archive and calendar, preserving roots and timelines beyond the lifespan of any city or dynasty. Humanity was left with instruments pointed upward, calculations etched into clay, and rituals that doubled as operational maintenance. The Anunnaki did not simply leave Earth. They inscribed their exit into the structure of the cosmos as humanity understood it. The stars became reminders, not of abandonment, but of trajectory. And as long as observers continued to measure, align, and wait, the departure remained an open equation rather than a closed myth. As generations passed, the certainty of departure transformed into expectation. What had once been an operational timeline slowly crystallized into prophecy, not because the calculations failed, but because access to the full system narrowed. The sky still moved according to measure, but fewer hands remembered how to read it completely. In this narrowing, prediction replaced coordination, and return became something anticipated rather than scheduled. Sumerian prophetic texts from the later periods reveal a shift in tone without a loss of precision. The language becomes conditional, yet remains mathematical. Cycles are no longer described as active pathways, but as gates that open and close according to cosmic alignment. Tablet fragments from Nippur describe these gates not as metaphors, but as windows of feasibility, periods when the conditions required for transit between realms align across multiple variables. Central to these calculations is the recurring figure of 3,600 years. This number is not mystical decoration. It is embedded in base 60 mathematics, the same system used for astronomical calculation and timekeeping. The texts associate this cycle with the return of a distant celestial body whose orbit influences gravitational stability and navigational corridors. Modern astronomy has no official category for such an object, Yet the consistency of the calculations across centuries suggests persistent observation rather than invention. Within each major cycle, shorter intervals are identified. 600-year subcycles are marked as periods of increased signal clarity. The tablets describe these intervals as times when communication becomes easier, when signs multiply, and when the watchers may draw nearer without full return. The language emphasizes preparation, not arrival. Humanity is expected to be ready before contact resumes. What defines readiness is described in unsettlingly concrete terms. Prophetic texts list thresholds tied to population stability, agricultural resilience, and technological continuity. These are not moral judgments, they are system checks. When indicators fall below acceptable ranges, the probability of intervention increases. The texts do not promise salvation. They outline contingency. Environmental instability receives particular attention. Descriptions of altered rainfall patterns, temperature anomalies, and atmospheric change appear alongside numerical values. These passages read less like poetry and more like early climate modeling. The implication is clear. Planetary conditions affect the viability of return as much as human behavior does. Technological regression is treated as equally critical. Several tablets describe future periods when essential knowledge fragments, when cities lose the ability to maintain infrastructure, and when accumulated understanding decays faster than it can be rebuilt. In these scenarios, return is framed not as dominion, but as restoration of capacity. The goal is continuity of civilization, not control over it. Social collapse is measured as well. Texts enumerate indicators of systemic failure, including breakdown of governance, extreme inequality, and uncontained violence. These factors are treated quantitatively. The language suggests thresholds rather than judgments, reinforcing the impression that intervention criteria were designed as operational guidelines. These prophecies did not remain abstract. Archaeological evidence shows that later rulers acted on them. In Babylon, construction projects aligned precisely with predicted windows of heightened activity. Underground chambers near major gates were equipped with communication devices, supply stores, and accommodation spaces designed for rapid activation. These were not symbolic gestures. They were preparations. Temple maintenance protocols expanded to include regular testing of preserved equipment. Astronomical instruments were calibrated, resonance chambers cleaned, and crystalline devices realigned according to schedules tied to predictive calculations. Administrative tablets record these procedures in meticulous detail, indicating sustained institutional commitment. Offering rituals associated with return preparation were technical in nature. Specific metals, crystalline structures, aromatic compounds, and biological materials were combined according to formulae. These offerings are described as beacons, designed to generate detectable signatures rather than appease emotion. The rituals required precise timing, often coordinated across multiple sites, reinforcing their functional character. Seasonal festivals incorporated these practices into public tradition, masking technical operations as religious observance. Participants believed they were honoring gods. In reality, they were maintaining readiness. This dual function allowed the system to persist even as explicit understanding faded. Later, Babylonian and Assyrian texts demonstrate refinement rather than degradation of predictive systems. Astronomers incorporated additional variables, correcting for long-term changes in planetary motion and stellar position. Mathematical techniques grew more sophisticated, employing approximation methods and error correction. The precision achieved suggests continuity of advanced training through restricted lineages. Persian-era texts reveal further expansion. Zoroastrian cyclical time concepts were integrated, extending predictive scope beyond Mesopotamia to global patterns. Return conditions became planetary rather than regional. Climate, population, and technological indicators were assessed across vast territories, implying access to information networks far broader than previously assumed. Despite this expansion, the core framework remained intact. The cycles persisted. The thresholds held. Communication attempts continued at prescribed intervals. Some texts describe brief responses, faint signals interpreted through omen or astronomical anomaly. These were recorded cautiously, without declaration of fulfillment. Over time, expectation shifted from certainty to vigilance. The return was no longer imminent, but it was never abandoned. Institutions adapted, knowledge fragmented, and languages changed, yet the scaffolding of prediction endured. Even when later cultures dismissed these practices as superstition, they unknowingly preserved operational remnants through ritual and tradition. What emerges from this long arc is a picture of deliberate patience. The Anunnaki departure was never meant to be final in the human sense of endings. It was conditional, bound to cycles larger than lifetimes or empires. Humanity was left not with a promise, but with a schedule written in the sky, encoded in stone, and carried quietly through blood and memory. The question was never whether return would occur. It was whether the world would still be capable of recognizing it when the gates opened again. As centuries layered themselves over the departure, the mechanisms designed for readiness began to blur into belief. What had once been operational discipline slowly transformed into doctrine, yet the underlying structures did not dissolve. They adapted. Where direct calculation became rare, symbolic systems expanded to carry compressed meaning. Ritual, myth, and law became vessels for procedures no longer fully understood, preserving function through disguise. The priesthoods responsible for maintaining these systems evolved accordingly. Their role shifted from technicians to interpreters, yet traces of their original mandate remained embedded in training. Instruction still emphasized pattern recognition, cyclical thinking, and precise timing. Even as language drifted, the insistence on numerical order and celestial correspondence persisted. The sky remained the final authority, even when its logic was reframed as divine will. In legal texts from later Mesopotamian periods, echoes of this system appear unexpectedly. Codes governing land use, water management, and labor cycles align closely with astronomical calendars rather than seasonal convenience alone. These alignments mirror thresholds described in earlier return preparation tablets, suggesting that governance itself had absorbed predictive frameworks originally designed for cosmic monitoring. Society was being regulated according to rhythms larger than immediate human need. Dream interpretation became a critical interface. Once a controlled channel for guardian communication, dreams expanded into a formalized system of analysis. Manuals cataloged dream symbols with remarkable specificity, linking imagery to timing, location, and expected outcome. While later traditions treated these as omens, the underlying structure reflects signal interpretation. Meaning was extracted not from emotion, but from pattern recurrence. The emergence of omen literature follows the same trajectory. Astronomical events, animal behavior, and environmental anomalies were logged systematically. Each observation was paired with outcome probabilities rather than moral judgment. This practice, often dismissed as superstition, functioned as long-term data collection. Over generations, these records allowed institutions to track deviation from expected baselines, maintaining a crude but persistent form of monitoring. Architectural continuity reinforced this framework. Temples rebuilt atop older foundations retained orientations aligned to ancient celestial markers, even when original purpose was forgotten. Builders replicated proportions and angles out of tradition, unknowingly preserving sightlines essential for astronomical reference. In this way, form outlived understanding, maintaining functionality through imitation. Language itself absorbed the system. Words associated with fate, decree, and destiny originate from terms meaning measurement or assignment. What later cultures interpreted as divine inevitability began as scheduled outcome. Destiny was not mysticism. It was timetable. This semantic shift obscured agency while preserving expectation. The integration of these ideas into emerging monotheistic frameworks did not erase them. Instead, they were reframed. A singular divine will replaced a council, but the cycles remained. End times, renewals, and appointed days echo the same mathematical structure found in earlier texts. The logic survived translation, even as characters changed. Across regions, similar patterns emerge. In Egypt, temple orientations track stellar cycles tied to rebirth narratives. In the Indus Valley, city planning reflects astronomical alignment beyond practical necessity. In Mesoamerica, calendar systems track vast cycles with precision disproportionate to agricultural need. These systems arose independently in appearance, yet share structural similarities suggestive of inherited frameworks rather than coincidence. Bloodline preservation continued quietly. Families associated with scholarship, governance, and ritual repeatedly produced individuals capable of advancing these systems. While explicit genetic management faded, cultural selection maintained continuity. Access to education, control of archives, and participation in interpretive roles ensured that aptitude clustered where it was most useful. Moments of accelerated advancement punctuate the historical record. Sudden leaps in mathematics, engineering, or astronomy appear without clear developmental lineage. These bursts align with periods identified in predictive texts as sub-cycle openings. Knowledge long dormant resurfaced briefly, then diffused into broader culture before the window closed. Resistance to these systems also emerged. Movements advocating abandonment of ritual, rejection of celestial authority, or exclusive reliance on immediate experience periodically disrupted continuity. Yet even these reactions served a function. By challenging inherited structures, they tested resilience. Only frameworks capable of adaptation survived. Over time, the language of return became metaphorical. Salvation, judgment, and renewal replaced ascent and navigation. The underlying expectation remained, though stripped of technical clarity. Humanity waited without fully knowing what it awaited, guided by echoes rather than instructions. Despite erosion, some elements endured with surprising fidelity. Certain astronomical calculations retained accuracy across millennia. Calendar corrections anticipated precession long before its formal recognition. Architectural alignments remained precise despite repeated rebuilding. These survivals suggest that not all knowledge was lost equally. The most persistent element was timing. Cultures separated by distance and belief shared an intuition of cycles, of eras turning according to hidden clocks. This intuition shaped history itself, influencing when societies built, reformed, or collapsed. Even without understanding cause, humanity responded to pattern. The Anunnaki departure thus did not conclude with silence, nor did preparation vanish into obscurity. It dissolved into civilization, embedding itself so deeply that disentanglement became impossible. What began as operational readiness transformed into cultural rhythm, guiding behavior long after memory of origin faded. In this transformation lies the most enduring legacy of the departure. Not the promise of return, but the structuring of time itself. Humanity learned to live within cycles it did not create, measuring progress against horizons it could not see, carrying forward a vigilance inherited from an age when the sky was not just watched, but mapped for passage. When later civilizations attempted to explain the persistence of ancient structures they no longer understood, they reached instinctively for myth. What they inherited, however, was not mythology in its original sense, but residue. Systems stripped of context tend to masquerade as mystery. By the first millennium BC, the mechanisms once designed for observation and readiness had become sacred traditions, guarded not because they were comprehended, but because they worked often enough to inspire fear of alteration. This is why certain practices survived political collapse with uncanny resilience. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, pantheons merged and fractured, yet calendar systems anchored to celestial cycles endured. In Mesopotamia, even as gods were renamed and hierarchies rearranged, the timing of rituals remained stubbornly fixed. Festivals aligned not with convenience, but with stars. The logic behind those alignments had faded, but deviation was avoided as if it carried consequence. Royal archives from the Assyrian period reveal a quiet anxiety about disruption. Kings sought legitimacy not merely through conquest, but through continuity. Inscriptions emphasize restoration of ancient rites rather than innovation. This conservatism was not nostalgia, it was risk management. When systems are inherited without full understanding, preservation becomes safer than experimentation. Advisors known as sages, or apkallu in Akkadian tradition, emerge repeatedly in these records. They are described as bearers of ancient wisdom, trained in interpretation rather than revelation. Their authority derived not from divine favor alone, but from mastery of inherited frameworks. They advised kings on warfare, construction, and governance using principles that appear pragmatic rather than prophetic. Their success reinforced belief in the systems they upheld. Archaeological finds beneath palaces at sites like Mari support these accounts. Subterranean chambers equipped with observational tools, chemical preparation areas, and controlled environments continued to be used long after surface structures were abandoned. These spaces operated independently of dynastic shifts, suggesting that certain functions were insulated from politics entirely. The decline of centralized access to archive complexes did not erase their influence. Instead, fragments of knowledge leaked outward. Mathematical techniques originally used for celestial calculation found application in commerce and engineering. Astronomical observations designed for navigation became tools for agriculture and ritual timing. medical practices filtered into temple healing traditions, stripped of explanation but retaining efficacy. This diffusion created the illusion of organic development. Later, scholars attributed advances to human ingenuity alone, unaware that they were witnessing delayed release from sealed systems. Knowledge introduced gradually appears earned rather than inherited. This gradualism may have been intentional, preventing cultural shock while ensuring survival of essential frameworks. The persistence of symbolic encryption is particularly revealing. Technical instructions embedded within mythic narratives continued to function as teaching tools long after their origin was forgotten. A story about a god's journey encoded travel time, resource requirements, and navigational hazards. A hymn about creation concealed ratios and measurements. These narratives could be transmitted orally, preserving structure without exposing function. Resistance to this inheritance sometimes surfaced as reform movements. Periodically, leaders attempted to simplify belief systems, strip away ritual complexity, or sever ties with the past. These efforts often coincided with instability. The loss of embedded knowledge, even if misunderstood, weakened resilience. Civilizations that abandoned inherited frameworks entirely tended to fragment rather than transform. This pattern is visible beyond Mesopotamia. In Greece, early philosophers inherited mathematical and astronomical concepts without access to their original operational context. They reframed them as abstract inquiry, laying foundations for science while losing connection to practical application. In Rome, engineering flourished while cosmological understanding lagged, leading to impressive infrastructure without corresponding predictive systems. Elsewhere, preservation took different forms. In India, cyclical cosmology retained extraordinary temporal depth, describing ages spanning millions of years. While mythic in language, the underlying structure mirrors earlier cycle-based thinking. In China, dynastic cycles and celestial mandate concepts reflect similar inheritance, emphasizing harmony with cosmic order rather than linear progress. What unites these traditions is not shared belief, but shared scaffolding. Each culture inherited fragments of a system designed to operate across vast timescales. Without full access, they adapted these fragments to local needs, generating diverse expressions from common roots. Over centuries, the expectation of return faded into abstraction. The precise mechanisms were lost, the calculations incomplete. Yet anticipation lingered as an undercurrent. Apocalyptic narratives, renewal myths, and messianic expectations all echo the same structural assumption: that history is not random, but scheduled, and that intervention occurs at thresholds rather than continuously. The endurance of this assumption shaped human psychology. Time ceased to be merely sequential and became layered. Past, present, and future were understood as interconnected through cycles. This perspective influenced everything from agriculture to ethics, embedding patience and vigilance into cultural DNA. By the late classical period, explicit reference to watchers, guardians, or departed ones became rare. Yet the behaviors they had instilled remained. Observatories were maintained, calendars corrected, knowledge guarded selectively. Even when belief systems rejected earlier cosmologies, they retained the habit of looking upward for order. In this sense, the Anunnaki departure succeeded beyond its immediate objectives. Humanity did not merely survive without direct oversight. It internalized the structures necessary to endure uncertainty. The systems left behind evolved, fractured, and reassembled, but they continued to guide behavior long after their originators vanished from memory. What remained was not proof of divine absence or presence, but a civilization trained to wait, measure, and preserve. The sky remained a reference, the past a resource, and the future something to be prepared for rather than predicted. Inherited vigilance replaced direct command. The departure thus became invisible, not because it was forgotten, but because it worked. It dissolved into habit, into tradition, into the silent expectation that history moves according to rhythms larger than any single generation can perceive. And within that expectation, humanity continued forward, carrying the residue of an ancient exit embedded so deeply that it no longer needed to be named. As the ancient frameworks diffused across cultures and centuries, a subtle inversion took place. Systems originally designed to monitor the sky and preserve readiness for return began to shape how humanity understood itself. What had once been external oversight transformed into internal discipline. The absence of visible authority forced societies to embed regulation, foresight, and restraint into their own structures. This transformation is visible in the evolution of law. Early legal codes do more than regulate behavior. They enforce rhythm. Agricultural laws align with celestial calendars. Labor cycles mirror seasonal and astronomical patterns. Even penalties are structured around recurrence and balance rather than retribution alone. Justice becomes cyclical, not linear, echoing the logic of systems that assumed eventual recalibration rather than final judgment. Urban planning reflects the same inheritance. Cities across the ancient world were laid out according to cardinal directions and astronomical alignments that exceeded practical necessity. Streets, gates, and public spaces were positioned to maintain orientation with the sky. This alignment was not symbolic ornamentation. It anchored civic life within a larger order, reinforcing continuity even as political authority shifted. Education absorbed this orientation as well. Instruction emphasized memorization, repetition, and mastery of pattern before innovation. Creativity was permitted, but only after internalizing inherited frameworks. This approach produced stability at the cost of speed. Knowledge advanced incrementally, protected from collapse by redundancy rather than accelerated by disruption. Philosophical traditions that emerged later inherited these assumptions without recognizing their origin. Concepts of natural law, cosmic order, and harmony with the universe reflect the same foundational belief: that reality operates according to intelligible cycles. Whether framed as reason, logos, or mandate of heaven, the principle remains constant. Humanity is expected to align, not dominate. The tension between alignment and autonomy defines much of recorded history. Periods of expansion and innovation often coincide with partial rejection of inherited constraints. Yet these periods are frequently followed by instability, prompting renewed reverence for tradition. This oscillation mirrors the subcycles described in ancient predictive texts, though stripped of their technical context. Religious reform movements illustrate this dynamic vividly. Attempts to simplify belief systems, eliminate intermediaries, or reject ritual complexity often emerge during times of stress. These movements promise clarity and immediacy, yet they also dismantle structures that preserved long-term continuity. The resulting vacuum is typically filled by new institutions that unconsciously reconstruct similar frameworks. Technological development follows a comparable pattern. Breakthroughs arise, spread rapidly, then plateau as systems struggle to integrate them sustainably. Knowledge fragments when transmission outpaces comprehension. Civilizations that manage this integration successfully do so by reintroducing regulation, standardization, and timing controls reminiscent of ancient protocols. The persistence of secrecy within institutions can also be traced to this inheritance. Knowledge is compartmentalized, access restricted, progression staged. While often criticized as elitism, this structure functions as damage control. When understanding carries power beyond immediate context, controlled release prevents destabilization. This principle guided archive management and bloodline preservation alike. Even modern scientific methodology echoes these ancient habits. Hypotheses are tested incrementally. Data is peer-reviewed. Replication is required. These practices prioritize stability over spectacle. They assume that truth unfolds within constraint, a perspective inherited rather than invented. Cultural memory of watchers, guardians, or overseers morphs into abstract oversight mechanisms. Fate becomes probability. Providence becomes systems theory. The sense of being observed persists, though its source shifts from divine presence to impersonal order. Surveillance, accountability, and record-keeping replace ritual observance as means of maintaining alignment. This internalization reaches its peak when humanity begins to monitor itself on planetary scales. Climate models, population metrics, and risk assessments mirror ancient threshold calculations. Intervention criteria reappear, now framed as policy rather than prophecy. The language changes, but the logic remains. Action is justified when indicators cross defined limits. In this context, the ancient expectation of return transforms into a broader concept of reckoning. Not a god descending from the sky, but consequences emerging from imbalance. Humanity becomes both subject and observer, inheriting the responsibility once held by external overseers. Yet traces of the original framework persist at the margins. Stories of visitors, watchers, or teachers recur in folklore and speculative thought. These narratives often surface during periods of uncertainty, reflecting latent memory rather than evidence. They express a longing for guidance without surrendering autonomy. The endurance of these stories suggests that the departure left more than systems. It left a psychological imprint. Humanity learned under supervision, then was released before fully understanding the teacher. The resulting culture carries both confidence and unease, capable of innovation, yet haunted by the possibility of error. This duality shapes modern identity. Progress is pursued aggressively, but hedged with safeguards. Exploration expands outward, but accompanied by protocols and caution. The sky is again mapped for navigation, this time by human hands, yet governed by inherited restraint. The ancient exit thus continues to influence behavior not through memory, but through structure. Humanity did not forget how to be guided. It learned how to guide itself using borrowed tools. Whether this self-guidance will prove sufficient remains unresolved. What is clear is that the departure was not an end to oversight, but a transfer of responsibility. The systems left behind were never meant to control humanity indefinitely. They were meant to train it. And in the long arc of history, that training continues, unfolding within institutions, disciplines, and expectations that still echo an ancient moment when the sky stopped speaking directly, and humanity was left to interpret the silence. Long after the machinery of return had faded into abstraction, certain sites continued to exert influence disproportionate to their visible remains. These places were not chosen for beauty or defensibility. They persisted because they had once served as nodes, points where observation, preservation, and coordination converged. Even when languages changed and empires overwrote one another, these locations retained an aura of inevitability, drawing reconstruction again and again. Nippur is one such place. Though it never regained political dominance after the Sumerian age, every subsequent power treated it with deference. Kings rebuilt its temples not to assert control, but to legitimize it. Administrative texts from later periods reveal that ceremonies performed there were considered binding beyond ordinary authority. The reason is not theological prestige alone. Nippur had functioned as a central calibration point, a place where cycles were measured and decisions synchronized. That function lingered long after its operators were gone. Similar persistence is visible at Babylon. The city's importance cannot be explained solely by trade or military strength. Its repeated destruction and reconstruction followed an almost ritual pattern. Each rebuilding restored specific alignments, orientations, and subterranean features, even when surface architecture changed. The Etemenanki ziggurat, rebuilt multiple times, always returned to the same proportions and orientation, preserving sightlines whose purpose had been forgotten, but whose necessity was assumed. These sites acted as anchors for institutional memory. Priesthoods, scholars, and administrators gravitated toward them because they contained layered authority. Even stripped of explanation, the structures enforced continuity. Decisions made there carried weight because they were embedded within inherited frameworks no ruler dared disrupt. Over time, this persistence generated legends of sacred centers, world mountains, or cosmic axes. These myths are not origin stories. They are rationalizations. When function is preserved without understanding, narrative fills the gap. The axis mundi appears not because people imagined the world that way, but because certain places actually connected multiple systems of reference: terrestrial, celestial, and temporal. Pilgrimage traditions reinforced this effect. Journeys to these sites synchronized populations to shared calendars and expectations. Movement itself became a form of participation in larger cycles. People traveled not just to worship, but to align. The act of arrival at specific times reinforced collective rhythm, maintaining coherence across distance and diversity. As literacy expanded, written records increasingly replaced oral transmission. This shift altered preservation dynamics. Text could travel where institutions could not. However, without full contextual training, texts became fragments. Copyists preserved words faithfully while losing operational meaning. This process fossilized knowledge, transforming procedures into scripture. Scripture, in turn, reshaped authority. Interpretation replaced execution. Power shifted from those who maintained systems to those who controlled narrative. This transition marks a critical phase in the long withdrawal. The Guardians had designed for resilience, but not for perfect fidelity. Human adaptation inevitably reframed inheritance. Yet even reframed, certain constraints persisted. calendar reform efforts repeatedly encountered resistance when they deviated from inherited cycles. Attempts to simplify timekeeping often failed or produced instability. Societies discovered empirically that abandoning inherited rhythm carried cost, even if the reason was unclear. This tension is visible in debates over intercalation, leap years, and festival timing. Disagreements were framed as theological disputes, but their stakes were practical. Agricultural planning, taxation, and labor coordination depended on accurate synchronization. The sky still governed outcomes, regardless of belief. The same dynamic applies to architecture. Builders who ignored traditional proportions often produced structures that failed prematurely. Those who adhered to inherited ratios, even without understanding why, achieved longevity. Empirical reinforcement preserved ancient design principles under the guise of tradition. As human exploration expanded geographically, these inherited systems traveled unevenly. Some regions retained dense continuity, others fragmented. Where continuity persisted, societies demonstrated greater long-term stability, even when technologically modest. Where it broke, rapid innovation often accompanied volatility. The spread of monastic traditions illustrates this principle. Monasteries preserved rhythm through daily cycles, seasonal observance, and controlled transmission of knowledge. Though framed as spiritual discipline, these practices mirrored earlier operational constraints. They created micro-environments of stability within broader social flux. Scientific inquiry eventually re-engaged with the sky explicitly, reclaiming observation as a tool rather than a symbol. Yet even this renaissance operated within inherited scaffolding. Measurement systems, coordinate frameworks, and temporal divisions trace lineage back to ancient constructs. Innovation built upon alignment rather than replacing it. The idea of progress itself reflects a departure from cyclical thinking, yet remains bounded by it. Linear advancement coexists with periodic correction. Crises prompt reassessment. Reforms follow collapse. The pattern persists even as explanation changes. In this way, the Anunnaki departure achieved its most subtle outcome. Humanity internalized constraint without submission, discipline without oversight. The sky ceased to command directly, but it continued to structure possibility. Institutions learned to endure by aligning with forces larger than themselves, even when those forces were renamed or reinterpreted. The sites, systems, and cycles that remain are not relics of divine absence. They are evidence of a transfer completed. What was once maintained through presence is now sustained through habit. The watchers withdrew, but the architecture of watching remained. And so history unfolds not as a straight line away from the past, but as a spiral around it. Each generation approaches the same structures with new language and diminished context, yet still feels their gravity. The departure echoes not through memory, but through the continued effectiveness of what was left behind. As the ancient systems continued to operate beneath layers of reinterpretation, a quiet divergence emerged between appearance and function. What societies believed they were doing increasingly differed from what their inherited structures were actually accomplishing. Rituals were performed for meaning, yet they preserved timing. Laws were debated for morality, yet they enforced balance. Even when intent shifted, outcome often remained aligned with older designs. This divergence became most visible during periods of widespread transformation. When empires expanded rapidly, absorbing diverse populations and belief systems. The inherited frameworks were stretched to their limits. Uniformity of practice became difficult, yet certain core rhythms resisted change. Calendars could be localized, gods renamed, but intercalation rules, solstice markers, and eclipse tracking endured. These elements proved non-negotiable, not because of faith, but because deviation produced measurable disorder. Historical records from transitional eras show repeated attempts to simplify or rationalize inherited systems. Reformers sought to strip away what they saw as unnecessary complexity. In many cases, these efforts succeeded temporarily, only to be reversed after unintended consequences emerged. Agricultural yields declined, administrative coordination faltered, social unrest increased. The response was often framed as divine displeasure, but the underlying cause was misalignment. The persistence of error correction mechanisms is particularly revealing. Societies developed ways to detect when they had drifted too far from inherited baselines. Omens, prodigies, and portents functioned as early warning systems. While later interpreted symbolically, these signs often correlated with real disruptions, failed harvests, unusual weather, or political instability. The system did not explain itself, but it signaled distress. Over time, specialized classes emerged to manage these signals. Astrologers, augurs, and scholars filled the role once held by technical custodians. Their methods blended observation with interpretation. Although stripped of original operational clarity, their work maintained feedback loops essential for long-term stability. They monitored deviation and advised correction, even if the language of their counsel was no longer technical. The evolution of libraries reflects the same pattern. Early archives were sealed and selective, prioritizing preservation over access. Later libraries emphasized accumulation and dissemination. This shift democratized knowledge but weakened control. Without full training, readers accessed fragments without context. The result was proliferation of interpretation alongside erosion of precision. Yet even in this fragmentation, certain texts retained privileged status. Works on astronomy, mathematics, and medicine were copied obsessively, even when incompletely understood. Marginal notes reveal generations of scholars struggling to reconcile inherited calculation methods with contemporary observation. Their persistence suggests recognition of value beyond comprehension. Transmission routes also changed. Where bloodlines once ensured continuity, institutions gradually took over. Schools, guilds, and academies replaced hereditary roles. This broadened participation but diluted specialization. Knowledge became modular, easier to share but harder to integrate fully. The system adapted, trading depth for reach. This adaptation was not accidental. The original frameworks had been designed to survive under varying conditions. When one preservation method weakened, others compensated. If bloodlines dispersed, texts endured. If texts fragmented, ritual maintained rhythm. If ritual lost meaning, architecture preserved alignment. Redundancy ensured survival. The cost of this redundancy was opacity. As layers accumulated, humanity lost awareness of origin. People followed patterns because they worked, not because they were explained. This pragmatic adherence preserved function while erasing narrative coherence. The departure faded from memory, replaced by stories that justified continued practice without reference to initial cause. In moments of crisis, however, deeper layers resurfaced. Societies facing collapse often rediscovered older texts, re-examined neglected sites, or revived abandoned practices. These returns were framed as restorations of tradition, but they functioned as recalibrations. Humanity reached back instinctively when forward momentum failed. The medieval preservation of classical knowledge illustrates this instinct. Monastic communities copied astronomical and mathematical texts not for immediate use, but because they were deemed essential. These efforts bridged centuries of instability, allowing later rediscovery. The continuity was imperfect, yet sufficient to restart development when conditions allowed. With the rise of modern science, humanity unknowingly approached the original mindset of the Watchers. Observation regained primacy. Measurement replaced symbolism. Prediction became testable. Yet this return was partial. Modern inquiry excelled at analysis, but often neglected integration, advancing components faster than systems. The ancient emphasis on thresholds re-emerged in new forms. Environmental limits, population carrying capacity, and systemic risk entered discourse. Once again, humanity confronted the question of intervention criteria, now self-imposed. The Watchers were no longer external. Responsibility had fully transferred. This transfer revealed a paradox. The more humanity understood, the more it recognized the scale of what it could not control. The sky remained vast. Cycles extended beyond planning horizons. The ancient patience embedded in inherited systems contrasted sharply with modern acceleration. Tension grew between capability and restraint. Despite technological sophistication, the same underlying challenges persisted. Alignment, sustainability, and continuity remained central. Tools changed, but constraints did not. Humanity found itself reenacting debates once recorded in clay, now expressed through policy, ethics, and global governance. The Anunnaki departure, viewed through this lens, appears less like abandonment and more like a long-term experiment. Humanity was given tools, frameworks, and safeguards, then allowed to test its capacity for self-regulation. Success was never guaranteed. Failure was anticipated. The systems were designed to respond to both. What remains unresolved is whether humanity will recognize the full inheritance it carries. The structures still function, often invisibly. The sky is still measured. Cycles still govern outcomes. Thresholds still trigger response. The question is no longer about return from above, but about readiness within. In this way, the ancient exit continues to shape the present, not as a forgotten event, but as an ongoing condition. Humanity lives inside a design it did not create, adapting it gradually, sometimes clumsily, yet rarely escaping its influence. The Watchers are gone, but the watch continues, carried forward by a species still learning how to bear it. By the time humanity began to map the world with confidence rather than reverence, the ancient inheritance had already altered its character. What was once a system of preparation became a framework of expectation, and expectation hardened into worldview. Civilizations no longer acted as though something might return. They acted as though something must eventually resolve. History itself was shaped as a process moving toward reckoning. This perspective quietly influenced how societies understood catastrophe. Disasters were rarely treated as random. Earthquakes, floods, plagues, and collapses were interpreted as signals that balance had been lost. Even when explanations shifted toward natural causation, the instinct to search for threshold crossings remained. The question was never simply what happened, but what limit had been exceeded. This way of thinking is visible in the evolution of chronicles. Early records list events sequentially. Later, histories organize events into cycles, reigns, and ages. Time becomes segmented, not continuous. Each segment carries expectation of culmination, mirroring the ancient idea that processes complete rather than drift endlessly. The rise of eschatological traditions reflects this inheritance in its most abstract form. Endings are described not as annihilation, but as transition. Renewal follows collapse. Judgment precedes restoration. These narratives differ across cultures, yet share structural similarity. A system reaches capacity, intervention occurs, order resets. The logic is procedural, even when expressed in symbolic language. Importantly, these traditions do not emerge from despair alone. They arise from confidence that history is intelligible, that events follow patterns. This confidence traces back to a time when the sky itself was read as instruction. Even when meaning is lost, pattern remains persuasive. Human ambition expanded within this framework. Exploration, conquest, and innovation were pursued aggressively, yet often justified as fulfillment of destiny rather than arbitrary expansion. Empires claimed mandate, fate, or providence. These claims masked continuity with earlier assumptions that power operates within predetermined bounds. When boundaries were exceeded, collapse followed with uncanny regularity. Overextension drained resources. Ecological damage undermined agriculture. Inequality destabilized governance. These failures reinforced belief in unseen limits. Even without knowledge of ancient calculations, societies sensed that survival required restraint. The scientific revolution reframed these insights. Limits became laws. Cycles became equations. Thresholds became models. The language changed, but the underlying concern persisted. Humanity sought to understand not just how systems functioned, but where they failed. The emergence of probability theory illustrates this shift. Uncertainty was quantified rather than feared. Risk replaced omen. Yet the act of quantification itself reflects inherited vigilance. Measuring uncertainty is a way of preparing for intervention, whether through policy or technology. Globalization intensified this dynamic. Interconnected systems magnified consequences. Local imbalance produced global effect. For the first time, humanity faced planetary thresholds consciously. Climate models, biodiversity metrics, and resource projections forced recognition of limits long embedded in inherited frameworks. In response, institutions emerged that resemble ancient councils in function if not form. International bodies convene to assess risk, debate timelines, and recommend action. Data replaces divination, yet the structure remains strikingly familiar. Decisions are delayed until indicators align. Intervention is weighed against unintended consequence. Withdrawal is considered alongside engagement. The language of stewardship gains prominence. Humanity is no longer master of the earth, but caretaker. This role echoes the guardianship once assigned to remaining watchers. Responsibility shifts fully inward. There is no higher authority to correct error. Failure would be self-inflicted. At the same time, fascination with ancient visitors resurfaces periodically. Popular narratives imagine return as rescue or revelation. These stories often appear during periods of rapid change or uncertainty. They express a latent desire for external resolution, a hope that responsibility might be shared once again. Yet these narratives rarely engage with the deeper implication of the departure. If return occurs, it would not absolve humanity of responsibility. It would test readiness. The ancient systems were never designed to save a species unwilling to regulate itself. Intervention was conditional, not guaranteed. This realization introduces discomfort. It challenges narratives of inevitable progress or divine protection. It suggests that survival depends on alignment rather than dominance. The sky does not promise salvation. It enforces constraint. The persistence of ancient sites, calendars, and structures serves as quiet reminder. They stand not as monuments to lost gods, but as markers of a completed transfer. Humanity inherited not power, but obligation. The Watchers left because their role had ended, not because the experiment had failed. Whether humanity will meet the conditions once set remains uncertain. The systems still function, though fragmented. Knowledge persists, though uneven. Observation continues, though accelerated beyond patience. The challenge lies not in capability, but in discipline. The Anunnaki departure thus reframes history as apprenticeship rather than abandonment. Humanity was trained within constraints, then released to operate independently. The success of that release depends not on remembering names or myths, but on honoring structure. The sky remains unchanged. Cycles continue. Thresholds still exist. What has changed is who bears the burden of recognition. No council convenes beyond the earth. No watchers adjust parameters unseen. Humanity stands alone within systems it did not design, yet must now maintain. In this light, the ancient departure is neither past nor future. It is ongoing. Each generation inherits the same question, rephrased but unresolved. Whether a species capable of understanding limits can choose to live within them. The answer will not arrive from above. It will be written in outcomes, measured against cycles older than memory, waiting patiently to see if the inheritance has been understood. In the modern age, fragments of the ancient framework surface not through excavation alone, but through convergence. Separate disciplines, once isolated, begin to echo one another in structure and concern. Climate science, systems engineering, economics, and ecology all arrive independently at the same conclusion. Stability depends on respecting limits that cannot be negotiated away. This realization mirrors, almost precisely, the logic embedded in the oldest surviving records of departure. What distinguishes the present moment is scale. Never before has a single species possessed the ability to alter planetary systems intentionally or accidentally. The ancient texts anticipated such a condition obliquely, describing times when human activity would rival natural forces. These passages were not framed as moral warning, but as feasibility assessment. Intervention, they suggest, becomes necessary only when internal regulation fails. Modern governance struggles with this burden. Institutions designed for national or regional concerns now confront global thresholds. Decision-making slows as complexity increases. Models proliferate, yet consensus remains elusive. This paralysis echoes earlier council debates, stripped of their cosmic context but retaining structural similarity. Humanity now occupies the position once held by the overseers, forced to balance action against consequence with incomplete certainty. Technological acceleration complicates matters further. Innovation outpaces cultural adaptation. Tools capable of transformation spread faster than understanding of their systemic impact. This imbalance was anticipated in ancient protocols that restricted access to advanced knowledge until readiness was demonstrated. Modern society has inverted that logic, prioritizing distribution over integration. The consequences are measurable. Ecological strain intensifies. Information overload fragments attention. Systems optimized for efficiency sacrifice resilience. These failures are not sudden. They emerge gradually, detectable only through long-term observation. Once again, humanity must relearn patience, a quality deeply embedded in ancient preparation frameworks. Astronomy offers a revealing parallel. As human instruments extend observation beyond the solar system, the same challenges arise. Data accumulates faster than interpretation. Models improve incrementally. Expectations of discovery collide with vast timescales. The sky resists immediacy. It rewards sustained measurement over spectacle, reinforcing ancient lessons through modern practice. The renewed search for extraterrestrial intelligence reflects this tension. Signals are sought, hypotheses tested, yet confirmation remains elusive. The expectation of contact persists, but without timetable. This mirrors the post-departure condition described in ancient texts. Readiness without certainty, vigilance without promise. Importantly, modern inquiry increasingly emphasizes biosignatures, habitability, and long-term sustainability rather than conquest or colonization. The focus shifts from expansion to continuity. Survival becomes the metric of success, aligning contemporary priorities with ancient threshold-based thinking. Cultural narratives adapt accordingly. Apocalyptic imagery gives way to scenarios of managed transition. Collapse is reframed as risk, not destiny. Renewal is planned rather than awaited. This shift represents maturation rather than loss of faith. Humanity begins to act as steward not because it fears judgment, but because it understands consequence. Yet the temptation to externalize responsibility persists. Myths of rescue, reset, or intervention remain popular. These narratives provide emotional relief, offering the possibility that error might be corrected from outside. The ancient records, however, suggest a harsher reality. Intervention was never unconditional. It depended on demonstrated capacity to sustain order afterward. This implication unsettles modern assumptions. It suggests that readiness is not technological alone, but behavioral. Mastery of tools without mastery of restraint fails the test. The ancient watchers withdrew not because humanity lacked power, but because it had reached a stage where continued oversight would hinder growth. In this context, return, if possible at all, would not resemble salvation. It would resemble audit. Systems would be evaluated against criteria long established. Survival would not be guaranteed by advancement alone, but by alignment with constraints that predate civilization itself. Whether such an audit is real or metaphorical becomes irrelevant. The functional question remains: can humanity operate sustainably without external correction? The answer is being written daily, not in prophecy, but in data. The endurance of ancient structures serves as caution rather than instruction. They demonstrate what long-term planning looks like when lifespans are irrelevant. They remind that meaningful preparation spans centuries, not election cycles. The departure encoded patience into architecture, ritual, and memory. Modern society must rediscover it consciously. Education becomes central in this rediscovery. Teaching systems thinking, ecological literacy, and temporal awareness restores fragments of ancient training once reserved for custodians. knowledge must be reintegrated, not merely expanded. Understanding relationships matters more than accumulating facts. The challenge is cultural rather than technical. Tools exist, data exists. What remains uncertain is whether collective behavior can shift from short-term optimization to long-term viability. Ancient frameworks assumed such a shift was possible, but not inevitable. In that uncertainty lies the true legacy of the departure. Humanity was not given a prophecy of success. It was given a structure within which success could occur. The absence of overseers was not neglect, but trust extended cautiously. The sky remains silent not because nothing watches, but because nothing intervenes unnecessarily. Whether that silence persists depends not on discovery, but on decision. The ancient exit did not close a door. It removed a hand from the handle. What humanity does next determines whether that hand is ever needed again, or whether the system, once designed to outlast gods, can finally sustain the species it was built to leave behind. When the record finally runs out, it doesn't do so with prophecy or closure. There is no final tablet announcing success or failure, no inscription declaring judgment passed. The silence at the end is deliberate, not accidental. It mirrors the condition humanity was meant to inhabit, a world where outcomes are earned rather than announced. The last surviving fragments from the departure era speak less about the future and more about restraint. Language that once detailed cycles and thresholds gives way to statements of limitation. Knowledge is described as sufficient, not complete. Preparation is said to be adequate, not exhaustive. These distinctions matter. They imply an understanding that no system, however advanced, can anticipate every variable once autonomy is granted. What follows the departure is not abandonment, but exposure to consequence without mediation. Humanity inherits tools, structures, and memory fragments, yet loses certainty. This loss is intentional. Certainty freezes behavior. Uncertainty forces adaptation. The Watchers understood that a species shielded too long from risk would never learn to manage it. Over millennia, humanity tested this condition repeatedly. Sometimes it learned. Sometimes it ignored signals until collapse followed. Each collapse was interpreted through culture, ideology, or belief. Yet the mechanics remained consistent. Overreach destabilized systems. Imbalance propagated. Correction arrived not as intervention, but as breakdown. These breakdowns were never uniform. Some societies absorbed shock and reorganized. Others fragmented beyond recovery. The difference lay not in belief, but in structure. Where inherited frameworks remained partially intact, continuity survived. Where they were discarded entirely, recovery required reinvention from near zero. This pattern exposes a deeper truth embedded in the ancient design. Survival was not meant to be permanent by default. It was meant to be conditional upon behavior. The system does not punish. It responds. Feedback replaces judgment. In the modern world, this feedback loop has become impossible to ignore. Environmental stress, technological acceleration, and global interdependence compress response time. Delays that once spanned centuries now manifest within decades. Humanity experiences, in real time, the consequences ancient observers calculated across generations. This compression creates the illusion of novelty. Crises feel unprecedented because their scale is global and their pace relentless. Yet structurally, they are familiar. The variables are the same ones recorded in the earliest administrative texts: resource flow, population density, system complexity, and resilience margins. What has changed is visibility. Data exposes patterns once inferred through omen and observation. Models replace divination, yet serve the same function. They warn when thresholds approach. They do not compel response. That responsibility lies elsewhere. The ancient departure did not remove guidance entirely. It relocated it. Guidance moved from command to constraint. Instead of instruction, humanity received limits. Instead of orders, it received consequences. This shift was irreversible by design. The expectation of return, preserved faintly through myth and speculation, misunderstands this shift. Return was never promised as rescue. At most, it represented contingency. Intervention was framed as last resort, not destiny. Silence was always the preferred outcome. To maintain silence requires alignment, not perfection, but correction. Systems must remain flexible. Excess must be reined. Complexity must be managed rather than pursued for its own sake. These principles are not moral, they are structural. Humanity now stands at a point where these principles are no longer abstract. They dictate survival probabilities. Choices made in governance, technology, and culture determine whether feedback remains manageable or catastrophic. The system does not accelerate collapse. It merely stops preventing it. This reality dissolves the distinction between ancient myth and modern condition. The departure is not something that happened. It is something that is still happening. Each generation reenacts it by choosing autonomy again, without assurance. The Watchers, if they ever existed as described, are irrelevant to this stage. Their function has been absorbed. Humanity is both subject and steward. There is no external measure left to consult. The experiment has entered its final phase, self-regulation without oversight. In this phase, memory is optional. Understanding the origin of the system is less important than operating within it effectively. A society can survive without knowing why limits exist, as long as it respects that they do. Failure occurs when limits are denied, not when they are misunderstood. The ancient architects anticipated this. That is why they built redundancy instead of instruction, patience instead of enforcement, silence instead of supervision. They understood that the most enduring systems are those that appear natural, not imposed. Whether humanity interprets this inheritance as freedom or burden remains unresolved. Freedom without structure leads to collapse. Structure without freedom leads to stagnation. The balance between the two is dynamic, never fixed. The final measure, then, is not technological achievement, expansion into space, or mastery of energy. It is restraint exercised under capability. It is the ability to stop without being forced. It is the choice to remain silent because nothing demands intervention. If humanity reaches that state, the ancient departure will have succeeded fully. Not because gods returned or never existed, but because their absence no longer mattered. Silence would mean equilibrium. Until then, the sky remains unchanged. It neither promises nor warns. It simply endures, as it always has, waiting not for worship or contact, but for proof that the inheritance left behind was understood well enough to make return unnecessary. The story does not conclude with discovery, reunion, or revelation. It concludes with continuity. What survives after the last trace of departure is not memory of those who left, but the environment they shaped to function without them. The most decisive outcome of the withdrawal is that humanity no longer requires explanation to remain inside the system it inherited. At this point, the framework is indistinguishable from reality itself. Limits feel natural. Cycles feel intrinsic. Consequence feels inevitable rather than imposed. This was always the intended end state. A system that still needs to announce its authority has failed to complete its task. The absence of external governance forced humanity into a prolonged confrontation with causality. Action produces effect. Excess produces instability. Restraint produces resilience. These relationships are no longer taught. They are experienced. Civilization learns not through instruction, but through repetition and response. The disappearance of explicit oversight transformed accountability. There is no higher reference to appeal to, no hidden mechanism to correct error automatically. Every decision accumulates. Every imbalance compounds. Survival becomes an emergent property rather than a guaranteed condition. This shift alters the meaning of progress. Expansion without coherence accelerates collapse. Innovation without integration multiplies fragility. Advancement ceases to be measured by reach and becomes measured by endurance. The longest-lasting systems are not the most powerful, but the most adaptive. Ancient preparation anticipated this outcome. The withdrawal was not a test of knowledge, but of behavior under autonomy. Humanity was never expected to remember names, rituals, or instructions perfectly. It was expected to respond appropriately to feedback. Memory could fail, structure could not. The erosion of myth and the rise of abstraction are not signs of loss. They are signs of maturation. When frameworks function independently of belief, they no longer require narrative reinforcement. The sky does not need to be sacred to govern seasons. Cycles do not need gods to regulate systems. Modern humanity operates fully inside this condition. Global systems now mirror the scale once monitored externally. Climate, resource flow, population dynamics, and technological complexity are tracked continuously. Indicators replace omens. Models replace prophecy. The logic is identical. What differs is responsibility. No external agent moderates thresholds. Humanity alone determines whether correction occurs through choice or collapse. This responsibility cannot be deferred. Silence ensures that nothing intervenes prematurely. The recurring fascination with ancient return narratives reflects discomfort with this burden. External resolution promises relief from accountability. Yet the inherited design makes clear that rescue was never the objective. Self-regulation was. If return were possible in any form, it would not function as salvation. It would mark failure of autonomy. The preferred outcome is absence maintained indefinitely. Silence is not neglect. Silence is confirmation that intervention is unnecessary. The ancient architects understood that permanence requires invisibility. Systems that draw attention invite dependence. Systems that fade into environment encourage independence. The withdrawal succeeded because it left nothing obvious to worship, resist, or await. At this stage, humanity no longer stands at the edge of ancient design. It lives inside it. The distinction between inherited framework and natural condition has collapsed. What remains is choice enacted within constraint. The future does not hinge on rediscovery of buried knowledge or interpretation of forgotten texts. It hinges on behavior repeated consistently over time. Sustainability is not a concept, it is performance. If balance is maintained, nothing remarkable happens. That outcome will be mistaken for normality. If balance is lost, correction will arrive impersonally, without explanation or appeal. That outcome will be mistaken for catastrophe. Both outcomes are valid within the system. Neither requires acknowledgement. The framework does not reward belief or punish disbelief. It responds. The departure was never meant to be remembered as an event. It was meant to be lived as a condition. Humanity's task was not to look back, but to operate forward without supervision. Whether this task is fulfilled cannot be announced. It can only be observed over time. The measure is not achievement, but persistence without collapse. The sky remains unchanged. It offers no guidance because guidance has been internalized or ignored. Either way, silence persists. In that silence lies the final meaning of the ancient withdrawal. Not mystery, not abandonment, not promise, but transfer completed. What once governed from beyond now governs through consequence alone. Nothing more was ever intended.